Hello everybody. How are we today? Let's talk about understanding frequency distributions and correlations. And this is central to understanding reliability and validity. So now we're just going to get into some examples to help us interpret maybe some of the data that will be visually presented through our validation attempts. So we're going to understand frequency distributions. We're going to talk about correlations. Now, what is a frequency distribution? It's a visual display of the scores on a sample of a specific characteristic. And perhaps one of the most famous frequency distributions is the bell curve that is fitted to IQ scores. Right, and we're very familiar with that bell curve, and I want to show you something that's very similar to that. Traits are often normally distributed in a sample if large enough, and that means that we have the median and the mean pretty much line up as measures of central tendency, and then we slope in equal proportions away from the mean with ever fewer people scoring at the extremes. So performance-based measures may or may not be normally distributed. A measure doesn't have to be normally distributed to be a good measure, and I got some kind of examples here. Now, this is back from Psych and Law, and it's quite a while ago. You can see it's Psych 485. It's 4485 now. So this was done during the quarter system. Yeah, that long ago. And what we were testing out as a matter of curiosity more than anything, and as you remember, I have a pretty high need for cognition. We talked about that measure in the last lecture. So yeah, I do a lot of things just to see how they work. Students in Psych 485 were given the California Youth Psychopathy Inventory. Now, a normal measure of psychopathy is developed by Hare, the originator of the measure, the PCL, the Psychopathy Checklist, or Psychopathy Checklist Revised, etc., all its different versions, requires clinical interviews and then record searches. Some people are saying, can we measure psychopathy in an easier way? Can we do it with a paper and pencil test that we could just give to people? Well, the problem is, as you can imagine, most people, if they're reading a measure that's designed to assess one's level of psychopathy, they might not want to answer honestly. It might be relatively transparent. They might say, oh my God, I'm not going to answer this question that way. I'm going to answer it the other way because I don't want to look like a psychopath. Right? So the California Youth Psychopathy Inventory was interesting because it took a bunch of qualities that underlie psychopathy, but the questions presented them in a more positive light. So, for example, if I want to see if someone is perhaps manipulative or endorses lying as a tactic, I could say a question, to what extent do you like to lie? Well, most people go, no, I don't like to lie, right? But what if I reframe the question in the way of, I can make almost anyone believe anything? Well, notice, to some people that sounds like a skill rather than a negative quality. So most of the items are pitched in a way that those who are psychopaths would see the answer, would answer in the affirmative because they believe it's desirable, whereas non-psychopaths would be less likely to do so. And as we talk, this would help us differentiate psychopaths from non-psychopaths. Well, there's a bunch of subscales in the Youth Psychopathy Inventory. It's a long test. And here's the overview. If we give the entire Youth Psychopathy Inventory to OSU students, what do we see? Well, there's a couple things we need to know right off the bat. What's the possible low? The lowest anyone can score is 50, right? 50 items, minimum score is 1, so 50 is the lowest score. Highest score is 4, there's 50 items, so do the math, 4 times 50 is 200. So we have a range of scores, lowest possible 50, highest possible 200. So, we give everyone the test, and this is back in the day when we give people a paper and pencil test and then we enter the data. No shit, what an archaic way of doing things, right? And we create a bin, and I let Excel create the bins, and what it does is it separates the scores into, in this case, 7 groups, and these are the score cutoff points. So what do we see? Well, remember, a high score is 200. The average score is half that, or even a little less than that, 91 here, 105. And notice, anything that's approaching an extreme score, and we had about 40 people take the YPI on this particular day. We see that there's about 6 people who scored above 130, with 200 being the highest score. So what I'm going to say is, wow, when we look at a sample of 50 Ohio State students, we don't find any evidence of significant psychopathy in any of them, right? This would be well below the cutoff. Hey, whew, isn't that a relief? Okay, so, but let's get beyond that. What we do, though, is now we can look at the subscales. And notice, how are subscales generated? Remember, there's 50 questions, but do all 50 questions measure the same thing? What process would I use to determine that? Well, from the last lecture, by now you know factor analysis. So we would do a factor analysis on this, and then the subscales would emerge. We didn't need to do factor analysis because guess what? The authors of the CYPI, right, have done all the research themselves and already subjected it to exploratory and confirmatory factor analysis, and they identify these sub-factors that they group to create the large picture of psychopathic behavior. One thing we know about psychopaths is they are charming. And they often use their charm in a dishonest manner, to manipulate people. And that's an interesting thing about charm. Charm is not a nice word. And charm is not an adjective. Charm is a verb. To charm. And I employ charm to get someone to do something they wouldn't normally do. Think of a snake charmer blowing their lute, right, and having a cobra dance. Cobras don't want to dance. Cobras want to spit venom in your eye, right? So how do you get a cobra to do something that's against its nature? You charm it, right? So anyone who's charming you, I'd immediately be suspicious. Oh, this person's so charming. Why are they trying to charm me? What are they trying to get me to do? But that's an aside. So how did that same sample, if we look at the same sample, and this is going to be the same sample throughout this lecture when I'm talking YPI, how did they do on the charm scale? Well, now this is more interesting, because notice this is a relatively normal distribution. If we fit a curve to it, you could see that it's pretty much a bell curve. Not exactly, but pretty darn close. And if we ran the sample up to 300-400 people, the curve would probably take even a more bell-type shape. This is 50 people is a relatively small sample for this type of analysis. Personality researchers often use relatively large samples. Okay, now the dishonest charm, if we look at just the questions and combine the scores on dishonest charm, right, the score range then runs anywhere from 5 to, let's see, 5 times 4 would be 20, and what we see is a far different portrait. So we see that quite a few people, right, kind of endorse. This would be at a level of 3, an average of 3 on a scale of 1 to 4, 15.4. So we see many people are willing to use charm in an effort to get what they want in this sample, right? Oh, okay, so it's not a bell-shaped curve, right? And not every personality measure is going to yield a bell-shaped curve, right? Or any kind of trait measure. Now, let's look at another one, thrill-seeking. Well, a lot of pretty high in thrill-seeking, very similar to the last graph, if you will. And notice, so we see then it's skewed, and it's skewed here to where the greatest majority of people are thrill-seekers. But let us consider, who are we talking about here? We didn't do this in a nursing home. We did this in a college, right? And younger people, probably, all else being equal, are more inclined to be of a thrill-seeking, type. So it's not surprising. And notice it doesn't really represent any danger. Now, let's take a look at the remorselessness. And one of the features of psychopathy is being remorseless to do what needs to be done with little thought towards the consequences. And if it hurts people, so be it. That's just the way it is. That people don't demonstrate remorse for their actions. Well, here you can see a significant difference. Note here that we have 2 people at 5. Now we've doubled that to 4. Right, remorselessness, 9 is the center point, and it drops off. Here, what we see is definite, remorselessness. Yeah, so here we see that there's few people who are amazingly remorseless. In fact, there's only 1 in the sample that demonstrates an elevated level of remorselessness. Okay, more of the bell-type curve. Look at the lying subscale. Well, to what extent are people willing to lie? And note that very few people endorse the idea of lying, so we get fewer and fewer people lying. So this is one thing we do right off the bat. One of the things that we would do once we give an assessment instrument to applicants, then we should generate the frequency distributions and take a look at how the measure is performing overall. It tells us about our sample. This tells us about Ohio State students, at least Ohio State students, largely psychology majors taking psychology and the law. Right, so we can qualify it that way. What do you think? If we took this and we did it again at Fisher Business School, do you think we would get the same distributions? I don't know. And if you do think it's different, why do you think that might be? Just some things to think about. So, what do we do now? Well, now we've talked about frequency distributions. Let's move the conversation on to correlations. And correlational research allows us to see if 2 constructs have some form of relationship or not. And in this case, so now we've got a lot of different constructs that we can look at. Why don't we go ahead and see if one predicts the other? Now, people who are high in manipulation, right? We tested to see if manipulation had a relationship with endorsement of lying. And this is a pretty strong correlation. This is a 0.5 correlation. And what we see is that manipulators appear to endorse the tactic of lying as well. So the more manipulative, the more endorsement of lying as a technique. And doesn't that make sense? I mean, that shouldn't necessarily be surprising that manipulative people are more willing to lie or endorse the tactic of lying to get their way, right? Now, another scale that we didn't mention earlier was callousness. So how callous, how unfeeling are they? This is unfeeling. And then how guilt-ridden are they? And would you predict that people who are unfeeling are likely unbothered by guilt? And you say, yeah, I think that's plausible. Well, what does the sample actually tell us? Again, it's a 0.58 correlation, which is super high for this type of research. And that is callous people tend to demonstrate remorselessness as well. Okay. Sometimes, though, we see little of any type of association. And grandiosity is associated with narcissism or a component of narcissism, and grandiosity is also a strong component of psychopathy. But what we see here, does grandiosity correlate with lying? And here what we see is almost no relationship. The line and the R value is not even 0.1, it's 0.03. So we would say, well, there's no relationship, little relationship to lying and grandiosity. Okay? What we're allowed to do is just see relationships. Now, in our context, what we're more interested in probably is determining, does a person score on the measure in the assessment center, does it correlate with some on-the-job performance at a later time? And all we're trying to do is say, look, this assessment score does predict well their performance in some aspect of the job, or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, then we got to rethink the measure, we got to dump it and look for something else. Or we have to refine that measure. So it's about understanding correlations. Now, some people are tempted to take this number and say 0.05 or 0.5. Oh my God, that's an amazing correlation. It's a huge correlation. Then they leave it alone. And if you do that, my old stats professor at UC Irvine, with whom most of us took a stats sequence, and it was an impossible class, and we all took a pass-fail because he never gave A's. He was an animal, but he knew his statistics, and he showed us this, and he said, you know what? When you do a correlation, you have to look at the scatter plot. You have to go the extra yard, and you have to actually create a scatter plot so that you can see the physical layout of the data points. The reason is, he said, Anscombe's quartet. And what we're looking at here then is statistician Anscombe. Each data set consists of 11 XY points, right? So we have the same number, the N is the same, the number of data points. And look at this. For the 4 charts that I'm going to show you, the mean, the variance, the mean, and the variance are all the same. Okay? In these 4 graphs. So the mean of the X, mean of Y, same in all these cases, right? The linear regression line is the same, the correlation coefficient is the same, but let's look at the charts. And you go, son of a bitch. Huh, look at that. Okay, set 1, 0.8 correlation, that was what we would say, yeah, okay, I'm down with that. But notice, if you have a curvilinear relationship, same mean of both variables, same variance of both variables, same regression coefficient, but it is not the same relationship of those data points. So this is why we have to look, right? This is why we have to look at the physical, because if we just looked at the numbers, we would say, okay, everything's fine. But in some cases, not everything is fine. Here we see, you know, increasing performance up to a point, but then performance seems to diminish if that's what we're measuring there. Look at this one. This one has the same mean and the same regression coefficient as all the others. But every one of our applicants had the same score. What the hell? That is not helpful. So we always have to look at them. If we're working here, we're good to go. But if we see any of the other 3 shapes, then exploration needs to ensue. So thank you, Dr. Newman. The guy was an animal. He was a maniac. He was an aircraft carrier pilot in World War II. Yeah, that's some hardcore shit. Can you imagine trying to land a plane on that tiny little ship, pitching, etc.? Oh my God. Anyway, let's look at some data. Descriptive statistics, okay? We're going to pick on self-monitoring, self-handicapping, and sales ability. Okay, and these are measures that I've given to students. I believe this would have been in a social psychology class if I'm looking at self-monitoring to demonstrate the measures. So, and self-handicapping as well. And then people's perceived, this was just their perceived sales ability in this sample. Not an actual measure sales ability, because we would be unable to do that. But the question is, does self-monitoring, that is the willingness to see how you're coming off to someone and change your style to change their reaction. High self-monitors are willing to do that. Low self-monitors don't do that, right? Now, self-handicapping is the extent to which people prepare excuses for future failure. And obviously we vary in that. Some of us are all ready to say, hey, it's no wonder I failed, look what happened, right? And others of us just kind of take responsibility for a failure. And then self-rated sales ability. But the idea is, I think that self-monitoring might be a good way to predict sales performance. That is, if I'm able to adapt to my customer, right, I might increase the liking, the intimacy, and make more sales as a result of that. So we're thinking self-monitoring might be a good predictor. High self-monitors might actually be better sales reps, at least in certain contexts. But self-handicappers might actually be, that might be an indication of poorer sales results, or it might not have anything to do with anything, right? Don't know. So, let us then do the frequency distribution, and what do we see? Well, right off the bat, we see somewhat of a normal distribution. Let us not, be too willing to toss out the idea of a bell-shaped curve yet, because this is a very small sample. We should have 200 or 300 people. This actually has bordering on 26 people, which would be about the class size. Okay. Now, we look at this and we say, oh, wow, it appears to be relatively normally distributed, maybe a little high skewed, a little towards high self-monitors in this sample, right? But now here's where we can kind of look at adverse impact. If this was a large sample, for example, if we had 300 people, and we say, there's the mode, that's the highest value, but look at, we have a second mode here. This is a bimodal distribution, or at least has the potential if it was a large sample. And we say, okay, does this represent one group of people here and this represent another group of people here? I don't know. Does it? And then we might check according to ethnicity or gender, you know, and if we see that our measure, and this turns out to be the African Americans in our sample, and this tends to be the white people in our sample, we might say that measure looks like it's separating people on the basis of ethnicity, or if this is women and this is men, it seems to be separating people on the basis of their gender. That smells like adverse impact. Let's investigate it further, and we might then not want to use this measure. So the frequency distribution is a great way, a second way in our toolkit now to assess adverse impact. So what do we know? Well, as we begin to collect the data on the candidates, or if we're really sneaky, we collect data on incumbents before we ever use those measures on applicants, because incumbents are around and we can test the measures on them. And the deal with incumbents is we should know the high performers versus the low performers, so we can always check, hey, we're using this new measure, let's test it on incumbents. Did it predict the high performers and the low performers in our incumbents? And if so, then maybe we're justified in using it on applicants. You get the idea of the multiple step process. Couple questions. Is the measure normally distributed? And like I said, it doesn't need to be, but that's a question. It may be a desirable trait that forms a skewed distribution. So if it's a measure of conscientiousness and we see, hey, wow, it stacks up on high conscientiousness, that's not a bad thing, right? That's actually a good thing. Okay? But if everyone is at the top conscientiousness bar, then the measure didn't differentiate between people, so we need to revisit that. Is the distribution bimodal? And if so, what explains the bimodality? Is it explained by ethnicity or gender? Then we probably got problems with adverse impact that we have to correct, right? So, note that the mean and standard deviations are also important in understanding that to a greater extent. So let's look at the self-handicapping, and now we see self-handicapping is pretty much, that's about as normal a distribution as you'll see. But sales ability, interestingly, note how it's skewed, and this was self-assessed sales ability. Like I said, people are saying, yeah, I'm a good but don't people normally think well of themselves? So we would expect to see the distribution skewed in this manner. Sales ability should be done in an empirical fashion rather than self-rating, right? But sales ability and self-monitoring, what can we see here? Well, we look at the correlation coefficient, that's 0.3, and that's a pretty strong correlation. And then we do the Anscombe-Quartet, we actually look and we see, well, yeah, that looks like it's an interesting distribution. It looks like it qualifies as a legit distribution. I don't see anything strange there. And what this means then is self-monitoring scores do tend to predict sales ability, or in this case perception of sales ability, because we don't have a real measure of sales ability. But now I can step back and say, you know, I think it's probably, we should investigate further that it's probably legitimate, it's probably a valid use, that self-monitoring is a valid predictor of sales ability. But notice it's on the basis of data. Okay. Now, sales ability and self-handicapping. So now we look at two measures, and what do we have? We don't have much at all. In fact, the correlation is 0.04. There's virtually no correlation at all. So sales ability and self-handicapping, not correlated for what that's worth, right? And then let's look at, so we're not going to use a measure of self-handicapping to assess someone's potential sales ability on the job. And further, we can look at this self-handicapping and self-monitoring. There's absolutely no correlation whatsoever. 0.0078. That's non-existent. It's about as close to zero as you can get. Now, let me flip it around though. Let's suppose that these two, self-monitoring and the second measure, had a tremendous correlation. They were highly correlated. That piece of information might tell us that, you know what? We might not need to use both of these because they seem to be so highly correlated that we would believe that one would predict the necessary quality as well as the other. So it's also a way to maybe perhaps eliminate measures. So, observe relationships, tabular display. All I've done is take the correlation coefficients off those graphs and put it into a table here. So, homework 10 then is going to take from the pencil and paper assessment to constructs more realistic behavioral measures. Throughout the assessment process, validation is totally and absolutely critical. It allows us to assure ourselves and others that we're measuring what needs to be measured in the most effective way possible. And effective also has in parentheses reliable. Right? Our measures through the process of validation become increasingly defensible. That is, when we can go into court and we can start talking about the statistical analysis we employed in vetting our measures, validating our measures, we stand on stronger and stronger ground and less likely to lose our suit. Right? Our ability to argue that we're assessing bona fide occupational qualifications becomes increasingly stronger. So while statistics seemed like a silly academic exercise that was designed to torture us as students, I'm going to offer that statistics have profound ability to allow us to place the right person in the right position and do so in a consistent fashion. And if we're ever questioned, to defend our choices in the way we've done it. So, statistics to the rescue. Okay. Next time, and this is going to be an assignment that's coming up in April, is we're going to dive a bit deeper to look at dispersion, z-scores, techniques for combining scores to get an overall assessment number, and to help us rank order our applicants in an efficient and realistic manner. So guys, I hope you have a great day. Let's call this one good.